7 in the morning, in the back garden of a gated estate in Newport, Rhode Island. A 27-year-old maid was forced down onto the gravel path. One woman held her arms behind her and pressed her to her knees. The other one, 62 years old, the widow of a Don, the woman who really ran that house, lifted a full bucket of garden soil and emptied it over her head, dirt in her hair, down her collar, across her face, and she said it without ever raising her voice. Earth returns to earth. That's your place in this house. Be gone by morning. Clara Doyle didn't cry, and she didn't beg. She couldn't fight back either, and she wouldn't have, even if she could. Instead, she did one thing that made both of those women go completely still. And from the far end of that path, a man who wasn't supposed to be home for another 3 hours had just watched every second of it. The man who owned that house, and the most feared name on the Providence waterfront. Rosalind Marchetti had wanted this maid gone from the very first day, and that morning she was certain she'd finally finished it. She thought she was breaking a girl who hadn't anything left to lose. She had no idea who she'd just put on her knees. She didn't know what that girl had already seen inside her house. And she didn't know that the one mistake she'd just made was the one her own family would never be able to undo. If stories about quiet people who refuse to break are the kind that stay with you, go ahead and tap that like button. Share it with someone who needs the reminder tonight, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Now let's go back to the morning Clara Doyle first walked through those gates. 11 days before Clara Doyle ever walked through those gates, she was sitting on a hard plastic chair on the 4th floor of a hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, waiting for a room full of people she'd never met to decide whether her mother was worth saving. That wasn't the language they used. The doctor came out holding a folder against his chest and told her the transplant committee had finished reviewing Maureen Doyle's file and had voted to move her to inactive status on the waiting list. Clara had worked 6 years in that same building. She knew exactly what those 2 words meant. She asked him to say it again anyway. Inactive, he said. She stays on the list. She just isn't eligible to receive a heart while she's in that status. Her heart is at 15%, Clara said. I know, he said. So she's too sick. No. He set the folder down on the chair beside her, and for the first time he looked her in the face. She isn't too sick. That isn't the problem. Then he read her the 3 reasons, and Clara listened to all 3, and not one of them had anything to do with her mother's body. The first was insurance. A woman who receives a new heart takes anti-rejection medication every single day for the rest of her life, and there was nothing anywhere in that file to show that Maureen Doyle could pay for 1 month of it. The second was housing. 3 flights of stairs, an elevator that hadn't run since the spring, 1 radiator that had never been honest. That did not qualify as stable post-surgical housing. The third was a caregiver. The form required a named, registered person who would be responsible for her recovery, and the line where that name should have been was blank. Clara looked at the blank line for a long moment. I'm her daughter, she said. You'd have to be registered, he said. There's a form. Then give me the form. You'd also have to be documented as available. Full-time, for the first 90 days. He paused, and to his credit he didn't look away when he asked it. Miss Doyle, are you working? She didn't answer that. Sean was waiting for her by the elevators. He was 24 years old, and he'd come straight off a loading dock without changing his shirt. And when she reached him, he turned both pockets inside out over the plastic chair beside him and counted what fell. $61, a flashlight, 1 key. That's this week, he said. Put it away, Clara. Put it away, Sean. He put it away. He didn't look at her while he did it. He was the one who had carried their mother down those 3 flights in July, and in all the weeks since, he'd never once mentioned it. Clara walked to the stairwell, because it was the only place in that building where nobody looked at her, and she sat down on the cold concrete step with her back against the wall and did the arithmetic she'd already done 4 times that month. Her mother was 56 years old. She'd worked 31 years and had never in her life been late on anything owed to anybody. And now she was being quietly crossed out of the future because of 3 lines on a piece of paper. Not because she was dying, because she was poor. Clara's own nursing license had been suspended 11 months earlier after she gave a dying man a medication he couldn't pay for, and she had long since stopped explaining that to people, because explaining had never once paid for anything. She sat there in the dim until the stairwell lights clicked over to night setting. Then she said it out loud, because saying a thing out loud turns it from a wish into a decision. Any job, any house, I don't care whose. She found it 3 days later. The listing carried no family name at all. Live in domestic position, private residence, Newport. Weekly pay. Room and board included. And at the bottom, one line she read 4 separate times. Household employee, W-2. Eligible for the family group health plan after 90 days of continuous employment. 90 days. Group coverage would buy the medication. Weekly wages would buy a rental on the ground floor, and a caregiver could be registered, if there was money to pay one. 3 lines on a form, and 3 things she could buy. She signed the contract on a Tuesday. Then she took the family photograph out of her wallet, the old one that still had her father in it, turned it over, and wrote the number 90 on the back in ballpoint pen. She packed 1 canvas bag. It didn't fill. The estate stood 11 miles down the coast behind an iron gate that stayed shut for 4 full minutes after she pressed the call button. Nobody spoke to her through it. It simply opened. A woman was waiting at the service door, 60 years old, a ring of keys at her hip, wearing an expression that decades of practice had sanded perfectly flat. Edith Landry. I run this house. She looked at the canvas bag. That's everything? Yes, ma'am. Good. Less to pack. She turned and started walking, and Clara followed. 3 rules. First, no telephones on the 2nd floor, not in your pocket, not switched off, not out in the hallway. Second, when there are guests, you don't look at them. Not at their faces, not at what they're carrying, not at the way they look at each other. Third, she stopped walking. You were never here. Whatever you see in this house, you didn't see. Whoever you meet, you didn't meet. If you understand nothing else I've said, understand the 3rd one. I understand. What did you do before? I was a nurse. Edith waited. My license was suspended, Clara said. I gave a patient medication he hadn't paid for. Something moved behind the older woman's face, and then went still again, and she didn't ask a second question. Who owns the house? Clara said. You won't need to know. I'd like to. No. Edith worked a set of keys off the ring and pressed them into Clara's palm. You'd like to think you would. Floors, windows, laundry. You start at 5:30. Clara closed her hand around them. 90 days, she said. That's all I need. Everybody who comes through that door needs something, Edith said. Most of them have the sense not to say the number out loud. And then she looked at Clara a moment longer than she'd looked at anything else since the door opened. Nobody gets fired in this house, she said. They just get made to want to leave. Her first 3 days in that house taught her more about it than any of the 3 rules had. She was up at 5:30 and on her knees by 10 of 6, working the floors of the long hallway on the ground level with a bucket and a rag, because Edith Landry didn't believe in mops, and said so once, and never explained why. By 7 she had moved to the windows, and there were 41 of them on that level alone, and every one had to be done twice, once with the vinegar solution and once dry, and Edith checked them by standing at an angle to the light. By 9, the laundry had begun, and it never really ended. Clara worked 2 loads at once, one running while she folded the other, and she learned the trick of listening for the machine so she wouldn't have to walk back and check. On the 2nd day, a woman named Bridget, who worked the kitchen, told her that the last girl had lasted 19 days, and then wouldn't say another word about it, and turned back to the sink like the sentence had cost her something. Clara didn't ask. Every night she came back to the narrow room off the back stairs, and every night she sat on the edge of the bed and took the family photograph out of the drawer and made a small mark under the number written on the back. 3 marks by Wednesday. 87 left. She wasn't counting days the way a person counts down to something good. She was counting the way a swimmer counts strokes, to the far side of a lake. On the 3rd afternoon, the whole house changed rhythm without anybody announcing why. The gardeners were sent off the property by 2. The kitchen started cooking for a number nobody had given Clara. Bridget put on a clean apron in the middle of a shift, which Clara had already learned was not a thing that happened in that house for no reason. And at 4 o'clock, Edith walked the ground floor once with her hands behind her back, checking the windows at an angle to the light. And then she said, "Everyone in the front hall," and she said it in a voice she hadn't used in 3 days. They lined up along the wall. 11 of them, kitchen and grounds and house, all in a row facing the front doors with their hands at their sides, and nobody spoke, and Clara understood without being told that this was a thing they had all done many times before. She took a place near the middle. Edith moved her, without a word, to the end. Then the doors opened. He came in out of the light, and for a moment he was only a shape, and then he crossed the threshold and Clara saw his face, and something in her chest dropped like a stone down a well. She knew him. She knew him instantly and completely, and the knowing arrived with no warning and no time to prepare a face for it. Her hands were at her sides, and she made them stay there. She lowered her eyes to the floor she had washed that morning, and she looked at the grain in the wood, and she thought about her mother in a bed 11 miles up the coast. And she made herself breathe out slowly. Somebody said, "Good evening, Mr. Marchetti." Adrian Marchetti was 37 years old, and for 7 years he had been the man whose name people on the Providence waterfront lowered their voices to say. Ever since the night his father and his younger brother were both killed within an hour of each other, and the whole weight of that family came down on a man of 30. He didn't greet the line. He never did. He came down it the way a man walks past a fence, and one by one the people along that wall looked at him, because looking at him was permitted and expected, and because they all wanted him to see that they had nothing to hide. Clara didn't look up. She was the only one. And Adrian, 4 steps from the end of the line, noticed it. He stopped. Not for long. Not long enough for anybody standing across the hall to be certain it had happened. But he stopped, and he looked at the woman at the end of the row who was studying the floor as if the floor mattered. And something in the back of his mind turned over once, the way a name you can't place will turn over. And then it settled again, and gave him nothing. He didn't remember her. He couldn't. He had never once seen her face. He moved on and went up the stairs, and the line broke apart behind him, and the house exhaled. Clara went back to the laundry and finished the load and folded every piece of it correctly. Then she went to her room and shut the door and sat down on the bed. And only then did her hands begin to shake. She reached up and drew a thin silver chain out from under her collar and held it in her closed fist, and she didn't look at what hung from it. And she didn't need to. She sat like that for a while. 87 days, she told herself. Say nothing. Do the work. Get her mother off that list and out of that building, and then walk out of this house and never speak of it to a living soul. What she didn't know, sitting there with her fist closed, was that on the gallery above the front hall, a woman of 62 had been standing back from the rail in the shadow, watching the line the way she had watched every homecoming for 7 years. Rosalind Marchetti hadn't been looking at the servants. She had been looking at her son, and she had seen him stop. She had counted the beat, and she had counted it again after he was gone. To understand why Clara Doyle sat on that bed with her fist closed around a silver chain and told herself to say nothing, you have to go back 10 months, to a night in August, to 2 o'clock in the morning at the far edge of Federal Hill. She had worked a double that day at an all-night diner 3 blocks off the main strip, the kind of place that paid in cash at the end of a shift, and asked nothing of anybody, which was exactly why she had taken the job after the state board took her license. $41 in her apron pocket. Her feet hurt in a way she'd stopped noticing. It was one of those wet August nights, where the heat doesn't lift after dark. It just sits down on the pavement and waits. And she came out the back door into the alley to cut through to the bus stop the way she had 100 times before. That's when she heard it. Not a shout. Something smaller than that. A sound like a man trying very hard to be quiet and failing. It came from behind the dumpster at the near end of the alley, and Clara stopped walking and stood there with her hand still on the door she'd just closed, because every single thing she knew about that city was telling her to keep going. She looked. He was sitting with his back against the brick, one leg out straight, and a cell phone lay in pieces on the ground a few feet from his hand, as if somebody had made very sure of it. His shirt was dark, and getting darker. He was awake. That was the part she would remember longest. He was awake, and he was looking at nothing, and he was breathing in a shallow, careful way that she had seen in an emergency room more times than she could count, and she knew what that kind of breathing meant. And while she stood there, a car came slowly up the alley. It slowed almost to a stop. The headlights swept across him and held on him for 2 or 3 full seconds, long enough for whoever was inside to see exactly what they were looking at. Then the car went on. A minute later, another one did the same thing. Slowed, looked, moved along. And then a man on foot came through from the street end, saw what was against the wall, turned on his heel, and went back the way he came, at something close to a run. Clara understood the arithmetic of that alley perfectly. There is nothing in this world so heavy as a man who belongs to somebody dangerous. Everybody who passed him knew it. That was why they kept driving. And she stood there for what she would later admit was not 1 second, but several. And then she set her bag down on the wet concrete and knelt on the ground beside him and put 2 fingers against the side of his neck. His eyes came around to her, slow. She said, "I'm going to help you." He got out 3 words. "No police." "All right," she said. "No police." She got her shoulder up under his arm and she got him standing, and it took everything she had. And she walked him 12 feet to the diner's back door, and through it, and into the stockroom, and she put him down on the floor between the shelves because there wasn't anywhere else. Then she went and got the first aid kit off the wall by the walk-in, which was a joke of a kit for what she needed, and she did what she could with what was in it, and with the clean towels off the shelf, and with her own 2 hands, and with 6 years of knowing exactly where to press, and how hard. She talked while she worked, because that is what she had always done, and not one word of it was a question. His eyes were going. She took his face in her hand and turned it toward her. "Look at me," she said. "Stay with me. You're not dying tonight." And he stayed. Somewhere in there he went under anyway, and the stockroom was cold the way those rooms always are, and so she stood up and unbuttoned the wool coat she was wearing, which had been her father's coat, which was the only thing of his she still had, and she laid it over him and tucked it under his shoulder. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the shelving and waited, and she did not once ask him his name, and she did not once ask him who had done it, and she did not once ask him what he was, because none of that had anything to do with what needed doing. Sometime after 4, he came back up out of it. He looked at the coat over his chest, and then at her, and he moved his hand slowly into the inside of his jacket, and drew something out and held it toward her. A silver medal on a chain, worn smooth at the edges. St. Michael. She shook her head and pushed it back. "I don't take money," she said. "It isn't money," he said. "It's a promise." Then, headlights came up the alley outside, and this time, they didn't slow and keep going. They stopped, and men got out, and she heard how many doors. Clara stood up. She left the coat where it was, because moving it would have meant moving him, and she went out the front of the diner into the last dark of the morning with the medal closed in her hand, and she got on the first bus, because it was Tuesday, and her mother had dialysis at 7, and there was nobody else in the world to take her. She never told a soul in that house what she knew, and after a while the not telling became its own kind of work, heavier than the floors and the windows put together. By the 12th day, she had it down to a system. If she heard him on the stairs, she found something that needed doing at the other end of the hall. If he went into the library, she carried her cloth and her bucket into the dining room and stayed there until she heard the library door. If he came through the kitchen, she was suddenly required at the linen closet. She got good enough at it that Bridget started teasing her about being everywhere and nowhere, and Clara laughed the way you laugh when a joke lands somewhere near the truth, and said she was just trying to keep up. What frightened her wasn't him. She had knelt on wet concrete beside that man, and kept him alive with her own 2 hands, and she had never once been frightened of him, not even that night. What frightened her was the 3rd rule. You were never here. Whatever you see in this house, you didn't see. Because Clara Doyle had already seen something, 10 months before she ever heard of Newport, and she had it hanging on a chain under her collar, and every hour she stayed in that house was another hour of pretending she hadn't. So she did the work. Every night she came back to the narrow room off the back stairs and sat down on the edge of the bed, and took the photograph out of the drawer, and made 1 small mark under the number. 12 marks. 78 left. She'd stopped thinking about it as a number of days, and started thinking about it as a distance, the way you think about the far side of a lake. On the morning of the 12th day, Edith Landry got a telephone call at 9:20 and left the house without finishing her coffee, which Clara had never seen her do. She came back through the kitchen for her keys, already in her coat, and she stopped in the doorway with her hand on the frame like she was weighing something. "2nd floor," she said. "End of the west corridor. There's a study." Clara nodded. "Dust it, that's all. Dust it and come back out. Don't move anything on the desk. Don't touch the papers. Don't open the drawers. Don't wipe the glass on the frames. Just the surfaces." "Yes, ma'am." And Edith stood there another moment, and then she said something she didn't have to say. "That room belonged to Mr. Marchetti's father. It hasn't been changed since the night he died. Nobody in this house goes in there but me." She left. Clara went up alone with a cloth and a tin of wax, and she found the door at the end of the west corridor, and she understood before she ever touched the handle that she had been handed something she didn't want. She knocked. It was reflex, the kind of thing a girl raised in a small apartment does without thinking, and she was already turning the handle as she did it, because in 12 days nobody had ever answered a knock anywhere in that house. The door opened about 18 inches. There were 2 people in that room. Rosalind Marchetti was standing near the far window with her back to the light, and a man was standing very close in front of her. A heavy man of 63 with white hair combed straight back. Tommy Barone, who had been the family's consigliere for 2 decades, who had been the closest friend the old man ever had, and who had stood as godfather to Adrian at the church on the hill when Adrian was 9 days old. He was holding her hand, not shaking it, holding it, the way you hold something you've held before, with both of his around it, and his head bent down toward her. And Clara heard one piece of one sentence, spoken low, the way men speak when they've said a thing many times and are tired of saying it. 7 years, Rosalind. He's never going to let go of it. Then the door was open, and they were both looking at her. Clara took her hand off the handle. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was told to dust. I'll come back." And she pulled the door shut, quietly, the way you shut a door on a sleeping child. And she stood in the corridor with the cloth in her hand, and her heart going hard against her ribs, and she did not have the first idea what she had just walked into. She didn't try to work it out. That was the thing about Clara that Rosalind Marchetti would spend the next several weeks failing to understand. Clara wasn't a woman who collected things. She had a mother in a bed 11 miles up the coast, and 78 marks left to make on the back of a photograph. And whatever was happening behind that door had nothing to do with either. She went down the back stairs and started on the laundry an hour early. Inside the study, nobody moved for a moment. Then Tommy Barone let go of her hand and said something quiet, and Rosalind didn't answer him. She walked to the door and opened it, and looked down the length of the empty west corridor, at the runner, at the closed doors, at the exact spot where the girl had been standing, 62 years old, and she had run that house for 40 of them, and she had never once in all that time been careless. And standing there in the doorway of her dead husband's study, Rosalind Marchetti made up her mind about something. That girl was going to leave this house. 3 days went by and nothing happened, and Clara let herself believe that nothing was going to. She was wrong about that, but she wasn't foolish. She was simply a woman who had never in her life had the luxury of thinking more than 1 week ahead. On the 15th day, she was assigned the upstairs corridors, which meant the long runner and the baseboards and the tall windows at both ends. And she started at the west end and worked her way back. It was warm up there. She'd had the chain tucked down inside her collar every hour of every day for 10 months, and it had never once come loose. And she had never once thought about the clasp, because you don't think about the clasp on a thing you're not going to lose. She was on her knees at the baseboard with her arms out and her head down when it slipped. She felt it go. She heard the small sound of it on the wood, and she reached for it, and at that same moment, the door at the top of the main stairs opened, and Rosalind Marchetti came into the corridor. Clara's hand was still 6 inches short. Rosalind stopped. She looked at the chain lying on the runner between them, and then she bent from the waist with the ease of a woman who had never once in her life hurried for anybody, and she picked it up. She held the metal flat in her palm. She turned it over, and Clara watched the woman's face change in a way she'd never seen a face change, all at once and completely, like a light going out in a room, because on the back of that metal, worn nearly smooth by 10 years in a young man's shirt, was one word: Danny. Rosalind Marchetti had 2 sons. She had buried one of them at 24 years old, on the same afternoon she buried her husband, and she had walked out of that church between the 2 coffins, and gone home and run this house for 7 years, without ever once letting anybody see her sit down. Standing in her own hallway with her boy's name in her hand, she didn't raise her voice. She said, "Come with me." And she walked to the head of the main stairs and she called down into the hall. "All of you, front hall, now." And something in the way she said it brought them up out of the kitchen and in from the grounds, in under a minute. 11 of them, standing in a loose half-circle at the bottom of the stairs looking up. Edith Landry came in last, wiping her hands, and stopped when she saw what was in Rosalind's fingers. Rosalind held it up so the chain hung down and the metal turned slowly in the light. "This girl," she said, "has been walking around my house with my son's name against her skin." Nobody said anything. She stole from the dead. Clara stood at the top of the stairs and she understood exactly what had just been said about her, and exactly what it meant in that house. Money could be taken. Silver could be taken. Every one of those 11 people had at some time in their lives worked in a place where something went missing, and it got settled quietly. But not this. In that family, in that house, the dead were the last thing left that couldn't be argued with. And to put your hand on a dead man's metal was the one act nobody in that half-circle would ever have found a word to forgive. And Clara had one sentence available to her that would have ended it in 5 seconds. She could have said, "I was given it." She could have said who gave it to her, and when, and where. And she could have said what she had done with her hands on the floor of a stockroom off an alley at the far edge of Federal Hill on a wet night in August, and every single person standing at the bottom of those stairs would have gone silent, and the woman holding the chain would have had to put it down. But to say all of that was to say, out loud, in front of 11 pairs of ears, that she knew there had been a night, that she knew he'd been left in an alley, that she knew there was a thing in this world that had almost taken Adrian Marchetti and hadn't, and she had lived in that house for 15 days, and she had listened, and she had learned enough to know that a person who knew that much and said it in front of a crowd would not be a person for very long. And then there was the other thing, the simple thing, the thing that had nothing to do with danger at all. He had put it in her hand and called it a promise. So she stood up straight, and she kept her hands at her sides, and she didn't kneel, and she didn't cry, and she didn't invent one single word to make herself look better than she was. "It was given to me," she said. Rosalind's eyes didn't move off her. "By whom?" Clara said nothing. "Then you understand how that sounds." "Yes, ma'am." And that was all of it. Nobody down in that hall spoke up for her. Not one of them. She looked for Edith. And Edith Landry, who had run that house for 22 years and had heard almost everything that had ever been said in it, looked down at the floor and kept looking there. Rosalind closed her hand around the chain, and in the silence that followed, from somewhere below and behind them all, the front doors opened. He wasn't due back until evening. He came in out of the light with his coat over his arm, and stopped 4 steps inside his own front hall, because 11 people were standing there in a half-circle with their backs to him, all of them looking up the stairs, and not one of them had heard the door. Then they heard it. The half-circle came apart and folded itself against the walls, and the hall opened up in front of him, like water going out of a channel, and at the far end of it he saw his mother at the top of the stairs with something hanging from her fingers. "What is this?" he said. Rosalind didn't move. "She's had this on her since the day she came into this house." She held it a little higher, and the metal turned once on the chain the way it had been turning for the last 4 minutes, and the light off the front windows caught the worn edge of it. "Your brother's," she said. Adrian looked at it. He was 37 years old, and he had spent 7 of those years being looked at by rooms, and in all that time nobody had ever seen his face do anything he didn't intend it to do. He looked at that metal for what could not have been more than 3 or 4 seconds, and every person along that wall understood afterward that something had gone through him in those seconds that they were never going to be told about. Then he set his coat down on the chair by the door. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and very slowly, without hurry, without a single word, he drew out a silver chain of his own, and hanging from it was the same metal. St. Michael, worn smooth at the same edge. He held it in his open palm at the height of his chest so that the whole hall could see it, and he did not explain it. He had carried both of them since the church on the hill, right up until the night he left one in the hands of a stranger in an alley. Nobody in that house had ever seen the second one, and now they were looking at it. And the silence that came down was not the silence of people waiting to be told something. It was the silence of people who understood they were watching something that didn't belong to them. Rosalind's hand came down slowly to her side. Adrian's eyes went up the stairs to the woman standing at the top. And here's the thing, and it is the only thing that mattered in that hall for the next full minute. He didn't know. He had never seen her face. The alley had been dark, and he had been mostly gone. And in 10 months, the only thing he had been able to hold on to was a voice. A woman's voice, saying something to him from very close by while his eyes wouldn't stay open. He had looked for her. He had looked for her the way a man looks for something when money is no obstacle, and there's nothing else he wants. The diner shut its doors 3 weeks after that night, and the owner sold the lease and moved to Florida. The staff had been paid in cash out of the register at the end of every shift. There were no records, because there had never been any records. And there were no cameras out back, and the men he sent to ask questions came back 4 separate times with nothing, and after the 4th time, he stopped sending them. 7 years running the Providence waterfront, and the one thing Adrian Marchetti had never been able to buy was a name. He came up the stairs. He stopped 2 treads below the landing, which put his eyes level with hers, and he looked at her for a long moment, and Clara stood absolutely still with her hands at her sides and her heart going so hard she thought he must be able to see it in her throat. He asked her one question. Not who are you? Not where did you get it? He said, what did you say to me? And Clara Doyle, who had held her tongue for 15 days, who had let 11 people believe she was a thief rather than open a door she couldn't close again, found that she had nowhere left to stand. She could lie. She had thought of 9 ways to lie in the last 4 minutes. But he was 2 steps below her with his brother's medal in one hand and his own in the other, and there was no lie in the world that fit into that space. So she told him. "Look at me," she said. "Stay with me. You're not dying tonight." And then the hall went so quiet that Bridget said afterward she could hear the clock in the dining room, which nobody in that house had ever heard from the front hall in their lives. Adrian Marchetti didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood there on the second tread below the landing with both hands full, and he looked at her. And the great and terrible stillness of him, which had made grown men sit down in chairs, was all at once the stillness of a man who was afraid to breathe in case the thing in front of him turned out not to be there. Rosalind, from the top of the stairs, watched her son's face. She had seen Adrian in a fury. She had seen him give an order in a level voice, in that very house, that ended a man's life before the week was out. She had never in 37 years seen him look like he had something to lose. 7 years running that waterfront, and the one thing he had never been able to buy was a name. And that morning the name was standing 4 steps away from him, with a bucket of vinegar water at her feet. Nobody in that house said one word about it for 2 days, and that was how Clara knew it wasn't over. The medal came back to her on the 16th day. Edith Landry brought it to the laundry without any ceremony at all, held it out, waited for Clara to put out her hand, and went away again. Nothing was ever announced. No one was told that the thief hadn't been a thief. The 11 people who had stood in that half-circle simply began speaking to her again in the ordinary way, as though the whole thing had been a change in the weather, and Bridget, who had gone home that night and told her husband about it, never brought it up once. That was how the house healed things. It didn't. It just closed over them. On the morning of the 17th day, a girl from the kitchen came and found Clara on the back stairs with an armful of linen and said, "She wants you," and didn't say which she, because there was only one. The room was on the ground floor at the front, and Rosalind Marchetti was sitting in it with the light behind her and a tray already brought up, and there was a second cup on that tray. "Sit down," she said. Clara sat. And then Rosalind Marchetti, 62 years old, who had buried a husband and a son in the same afternoon, and had not let one person in this world see her cry since, picked up the pot and poured tea into the second cup and set it down in front of the girl who scrubbed her floors. That was the moment Clara understood how much trouble she was in. If the woman had shouted at her, she could have stood there and taken it. But nobody pours tea for someone they're finished with. "You've had a hard week," Rosalind said. "Yes, ma'am. My son cleared your name in front of the entire household. I imagine that felt like something." Clara looked at the cup and didn't touch it. "I want you to hear something from me before anybody else says it to you badly." Rosalind folded her hands. "You're mistaking gratitude for an opportunity." Clara said nothing. "It's the commonest error there is, and I don't hold it against you. A person does something decent, and afterward, they can't help wondering what the world owes them for it. But my son is grateful to you, and that's all it is. And gratitude is a debt, and debts get paid, and then they're finished." "Yes, ma'am." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said the second thing. "My son will marry a name, not a woman, a name. That's how this house has stayed standing for 51 years, and it's how it will stay standing after I'm gone. There are 3 families between here and Boston who would be very glad to see this one week, and the only thing that's kept them off our door is who we're tied to. You may think that's a cold way to live. I've thought so myself, on certain nights, but I have buried 2 men out of this family already, and I have not buried a third, and the reason I have not is that I have never once let sentiment make a decision in this house." Clara kept her eyes down and her hands in her lap, and then Rosalind reached beside her chair and picked up a folded sheet of paper, and she didn't hand it over. She simply held it and read from it in the same unhurried voice she'd used for everything else. "Your mother is Maureen Doyle. She's 56. She's on the 4th floor at St. Anne's in Providence, room 411, West Wing, the bed nearest the window. Her cardiologist is a man named Whitcomb, who does his rounds a little after 7 in the morning. She had her paperwork moved to inactive status on the 9th of last month, and she has a brother in Fall River who hasn't come to see her once." Clara's hands went cold in her lap. Rosalind folded the paper again and set it down. "I haven't threatened you. I want that understood, because you'll turn this conversation over in your head tonight, and you'll want to make it into something it isn't. I've simply told you what I know, so that you'll know that I know it." She stood up. "Know your place," she said. "Do your work, and stay away from my son." Then she walked out and left the tea untouched on the tray. and the door stood open behind her, because a closed door would have meant she'd been afraid of being heard. Clara sat there for a long moment. Then she got up and carried the linen to the second floor and finished the day, every hour of it, and nobody who watched her work that afternoon could have told you anything was wrong. At 9:30, she came back to the narrow room off the back stairs and shut the door and sat down on the edge of the bed and took the photograph out of the drawer. Her hands were shaking so badly, it took her 3 tries to make the mark. 1773 left. She put the photograph back in the drawer, and she lay down in her clothes, with her hand closed around the chain at her throat. And somewhere out past the window, a car came up the drive, and she listened to it the way an animal listens. And she did not sleep for a very long time. On the 24th day, a car came up the drive at 4 in the afternoon that nobody in the kitchen had been told about. And Bridget looked out the window and said one word, Falcone, and went and put on the clean apron. Vivian Falcone was 30 years old, and she was the only child of Salvatore Falcone, who had run everything north of the state line out of a print shop in Boston for the better part of 30 years. She came in through the front doors, and Rosalind Marchetti met her there and took both her hands, and whatever was said between them was said quietly and at length. Clara was assigned to the dining room that evening because Edith was short 2 people. She stood against the sideboard with a pitcher in her hands, and she did what she had been taught to do, which was to look at the water and the glasses and nothing else, and to move only when a glass was under 3/4 full. Adrian came down at 7. He greeted the girl politely and pulled out her chair and asked after her father's health, and he did not look at the sideboard once. Halfway through the meal, Rosalind set down her fork and said she had something to say and would say it in front of the staff, because it was the staff who would have to arrange it. The 2 families were joining. Vivian would be staying at the house from tonight on, not as a guest, but as a member of it, and the wedding would take place in 10 weeks. Clara heard the number 10 and did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way she now did all arithmetic in that house, and found that 10 weeks landed 6 days past the far side of her lake. She kept her eyes on the water. Adrian didn't smile, and he didn't object. He sat with his hand around the stem of his glass, and he let it be said. There were reasons for that, and Clara didn't know them, and the men who worked the terminal down on the waterfront did. In the last 10 months, there had been 4 separate incidents against Marchetti property and Marchetti people. The first of them on a wet night in August, in an alley off Federal Hill, and the 3 since had been smaller and more careful, and had come from directions that made no sense. 4 times in 10 months, when in the previous 7 years there had been none. A man in his position, sitting at a table with the only daughter of the only family strong enough to close the road from Boston, does not object. He said thank you to his mother, and he raised his glass, and that was the end of it. And Vivienne Falcone, who had spent her whole life at tables like that one, turned her head and looked at the girl standing by the sideboard with the pitcher. Just once. It didn't last 2 seconds. Nobody at that table noticed it happen, but Clara felt it land on her the way you feel a hand on the back of your neck, and Vivian looked back at her plate and picked up her fork, and she already knew. Some women need weeks to work out who the other woman is. Some can do it in the time it takes to fill a glass. Over the next 5 weeks, Vivienne Falcone did everything right. She was up early. She learned the names of all 11 of them inside of 4 days and used them. She asked Rosalind's opinion on things she already had opinions about. She sat with Adrian over the accounts of the construction company and understood them, and asked good questions, and was right twice about things he'd missed. She was not cruel to anybody, and she was not stupid, and by the end of the 2nd week, half that house would have told you she was going to be a fine mistress of it, and she couldn't get near him. He was courteous every hour of every day. He stood when she came into a room, and he saw her to her door, and he never once let her want for anything, and there was a distance held in place between them so evenly and so pleasantly that she couldn't find a single thing to point at and call rude. She tried. She stopped trying somewhere in the 5th week. On an evening at the end of that week, she found him alone out on the west terrace with the light going down over the water, and she stood beside him for a while without saying anything, and then she asked him straight out, "What does she have that I don't?" He didn't pretend not to understand her. He didn't look away either. "Nothing," he said. She turned and looked at him. "You're better than her at everything that can be measured," he said. "Your family, your schooling, the way you carry a room. If a man were choosing with his head, he'd choose you, and he'd be right. Then why?" And Adrian Marchetti stood there and told her the truth. And there wasn't any cruelty in it, which was the part she found hardest to forgive. 10 months ago I was on the ground in an alley and I couldn't get up," he said. 2 cars came by and slowed down and looked at me and drove on. A man on foot turned around and ran. He was quiet for a moment. "Everybody in the world left me there," he said. She came back, and Vivian Falcone stood on that terrace and understood something that had nothing to do with love at all, because she had never expected love and hadn't been raised to. What she had expected was to succeed. She went up to her room at 9:30, and her telephone rang at 10, and her father didn't ask her a single question about how it was going. Salvatore Falcone said one sentence to his daughter that night: "Don't make me call again." Something had been sitting in the back of Clara's mind since the 12th day, and it had taken it all this time to work its way forward. She hadn't gone looking for it. She had simply kept noticing the same man in the same places. Tommy Barone came to that house 3 and 4 times a week now, which Bridget said was more than he'd come in the whole of the winter, and he never came through the front. He parked at the side, and he walked the long way around, and twice Clara had seen him standing down by the water at the end of the lawn with a telephone in his hand, at an hour when nobody in that family was awake. On the 29th day, she had heard him say, in the corridor outside the office, that a thing was coming together nicely, and she hadn't known what thing, and she'd gone on with the windows. But she had been raised in a small apartment by a woman who noticed everything, and something in Clara had begun to keep a list without asking her permission. So on the 61st day, when she came out of the laundry at 6:30 in the evening with a load of table linen for the boathouse cupboards, and saw Tommy Barone's car parked at the side of the drive, and saw that the boathouse door at the bottom of the lawn was standing open, she didn't turn around and go back inside. She went down. She would think about that afterward, for years. She could have set the linen on a shelf in the pantry and gone to bed, and lived the rest of her life not knowing. She went down the lawn instead, and she went quietly. And the truth is, she went quietly on purpose. The boathouse had a partition down the middle with the cupboards on the near side, and the planking between them didn't reach the ceiling. She was 3 feet from the cupboard when she heard his voice on the other side of the wood and stopped with the linen still in her arms. He was talking low, the way a man talks when he's said something twice already. She pressed her shoulder back against the partition and stood absolutely still. She only got 3 pieces of it. The first was the name Falcone, said with no title in front of it and no warmth behind it. Said the way you say the name of a man you have an arrangement with, rather than a man you like. The second came a moment later, and she felt it go into her chest like something cold. "That thing in the alley in August," he said. "Not the alley. Not what happened in August. That thing in the alley in August," in the voice of a man discussing a job he'd been paid for and hadn't finished. And then, at the end, after a pause while somebody on the other end of that line said something, Tommy Barone said the third thing. "Not this time," he said. "This time, don't leave him lying there still breathing." Clara didn't move. She stood with her back against 1/2 inch of wood and a stack of clean tablecloths in her arms, and she understood 3 things at once, and the understanding arrived all together the way a wave arrives, and afterward she could never separate them. The first was that whoever had put Adrian Marchetti on the ground in that alley had not come from outside this family. He had come from inside it, and he had been at that dinner table, and he had held Rosalind Marchetti's hand in her dead husband's study, and he was 30 feet away, on the other side of a wall. The second was that the wedding wasn't a wedding. 10 weeks of arrangements. A girl moved into the house, 2 families joining, and none of it was what it looked like, and Clara didn't know the shape of it, but she knew you don't need a man alive to get his name onto a piece of paper. And the third was the one that kept her standing there long after the telephone call ended and the door closed and the car went up the drive. She couldn't tell anybody, not one living soul, because the moment she opened her mouth about Tommy Barone, she would be asked how she came to be watching him, and the answer began in the upstairs study on the 12th day, with a hand being held in front of a window, which meant that the first name out of her mouth would not be Tommy Barone's, it would be Rosalind's. And Clara had sat in a chair in a downstairs room with a cup of tea in front of her, and heard that woman say room 411, West Wing, the bed nearest the window, in the voice of somebody reading a grocery list. Clara wasn't afraid for herself. She had stopped being afraid for herself somewhere around the 4th floor of St. Anne's, on the day a committee decided her mother wasn't eligible. What she was afraid of was a 56-year-old woman in a bed near a window with a brother in Fall River who never came, and a 24-year-old boy who'd carry their mother down 3 flights of stairs again tomorrow if he had to, and never mention it. So she carried the linen into the cupboard and stacked it the way she'd been taught, and she walked back up the lawn in the dark, and she went in through the service door and said goodnight to Bridget in an ordinary voice. In her room, She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with the lamp off. Then she turned it on and tore a page out of the back of the little notebook she used for the grocery order, and she wrote on it for about 4 minutes. She read it over once. She folded it twice, and then a third time, until it was no bigger than a stamp. She took off her left shoe, worked the folded paper down under the insole at the heel where it wouldn't shift, and put the shoe back on. For 9 days after the boathouse, Clara worked with that folded paper under her heel and told nobody anything, and she was so careful. And it turned out that being careful had nothing to do with it, because the woman who ran that house wasn't watching her hands. On the 70th day, there were guests for lunch, 2 couples down from Boston, and Clara did the guest rooms afterward the way she always did. 1 at a time, door open, nothing in her pockets. At 4 in the afternoon, Edith Landry came into the linen room and shut the door behind her, which she had never done, and stood there with her hands folded. A pair of earrings has been reported missing from the blue room. Clara straightened up slowly. Diamond, in a small green case on the dresser. Mrs. Rosalind has spoken to me about it. Clara didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, I was in that room from 2:30 until 2:50, and Nora was in the hallway the whole time. Yes, that's been noted. Then check the corridor camera. Edith looked at a point on the wall about a foot above Clara's shoulder. The corridor camera on the 2nd floor has been down since Tuesday. There was a silence in that little room, with the shelves of folded sheets, and both women stood in it, and both of them knew exactly what had just been said, and neither of them was going to say it out loud. Nothing is being accused, Edith said. There's a procedure. 3 weeks of your pay will be held while it's looked into, and if it comes back clear, you'll be paid the whole of it. All right. It usually comes back clear. All right, Clara said again. And Edith Landry stood there a moment longer, and she had something in her face that she'd had once before, on the first day, when she asked what Clara had done before and got the answer, and again, she didn't say whatever it was. She opened the door and went out. Clara finished the linen. She went down and did the dinner service. 3 weeks of wages was $480, and $480 was the ground floor rental deposit she'd been putting aside 100 at a time in an envelope taped under the drawer, and now it wasn't. She would get it back or she wouldn't. She could live either way. She lay awake that night working out what she could take out of the food money, and she got it down to 11 weeks instead of 8, and she thought that was the worst of it, and she went to sleep. It wasn't the worst of it. It wasn't even the point of it. The earrings were the noise. Somewhere in that same afternoon, in the small office off the back hall where the household paperwork lived in a gray filing cabinet, Rosalind Marchetti had asked to see one folder, Household Staff, Current, D. She turned to the 2nd page, where the term of employment was set out, and she looked at the 2 dates written there, and then she took a pen out of the cup on the desk, and she made a very small correction to the 2nd one. Then she wrote her initials beside it, because everything in that house was done properly. It took her under a minute. She didn't do it in anger. She had never in her life done anything in anger. She did it the way a woman closes a window before the rain comes, and then she put the folder back in the drawer and slid the drawer shut and went upstairs to dress for dinner. Clara found out 5 days later, and she found out because Bridget mentioned in passing that the payroll list for the following month had come round to the kitchen, and Clara's name wasn't on the second half of it, and Clara said that must be a mistake, and went and asked. They gave her a copy of her own contract to read, because they were required to, and she stood in that little office with it in both hands. The first date was the day she'd walked in through the iron gate. The second date was the day her employment ended, day 88. And it is worth saying plainly, because Clara understood it in the time it took to read one line, that the family group health plan admitted a household employee after 90 days of continuous employment. Not 88, 90. She thanked the woman at the desk. She walked out through the back hall and up the service stairs and into the narrow room and shut the door and sat down on the edge of the bed and opened the drawer and took out the photograph. She turned it over. There was the number, written in ballpoint on a Tuesday in June, by a woman sitting in a rented kitchen with a canvas bag by the door, and under it, 75 small marks in 75 separate hands, some of them steady and some of them not, made one at a time at the end of 109-hour days. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at the 2 dates on the contract again, and she did the last piece of arithmetic she would ever do in that house. 88 days of floors. 88 days of windows done twice. 88 days of being everywhere and nowhere, of eating standing up, of lying awake listening to cars on the drive. And on the far side of it, exactly nothing. She didn't cry. She sat there with the contract in one hand and the photograph in the other, and she didn't make a sound. And downstairs, the dinner bell went. And after a moment, she put both of them in the drawer and stood up and went down to serve it. She had one afternoon off every second Sunday, and the 80th day was one of them. And she took the bus in from Newport and walked the last 11 blocks because the transfer cost $1.75. She had made it into a kind of ceremony by then. She stopped in the lobby restroom first and washed her face and did something with her hair and put on the cardigan she carried folded in her bag so that she'd come up out of that elevator looking like a woman who was managing. Room 411, West Wing, the bed nearest the window. Her mother was awake. Maureen Doyle was 56 years old, and she had been a school cafeteria manager for 19 of those years, and a housekeeper at a hotel on Weybosset Street for 12 before that. And there had never been one single day in Clara's childhood when that woman had come home and said she was tired. She was on oxygen now, and it made her voice thin, and it made her take her sentences in two pieces. And she still put her hand out for her daughter's hand the second the door opened. They talked about nothing for 20 minutes. Whether it had rained down at the shore, whether Sean was eating, whether the woman in the other bed snored, which she did. And then, the way she did every second Sunday, Maureen turned her head on the pillow and looked at her daughter, and asked the only question that actually mattered to her, and asked it in the light, easy voice of a mother who has decided not to be a burden. "Did they pay you this week, sweetheart?" Clara said. "They did, Ma." That was all. She didn't add anything to it. She had learned a long time ago that a lie gets bigger the more you feed it. So she just said it, and squeezed her mother's hand and asked whether Whitcomb had been in that morning, and Maureen said he had, and the moment closed over, and neither of them ever came back to it. She stayed until 4:45. Then she kissed her mother on the forehead and told her she loved her, and walked out of that room and down the corridor perfectly steadily, and she went through the door at the end into the stairwell, and she sat down on the concrete step in the exact same place she'd sat down 80 days before, and she put both hands over her face, and she cried the way you cry when you can't make any noise. And it wasn't the money. She wanted that understood. Afterward, when she thought about it, it was never the money. Money can be got. You can get $480 if you have to. You can get it by not eating and by walking the 11 blocks and by picking up another shift somewhere. She'd been getting money her whole life. What Rosalind Marchetti had taken out of that gray filing cabinet with one small stroke of a pen wasn't money. It was time. It was the 90 days. It was the only currency in the world Clara had no way of earning more of, and the only one her mother didn't have any of. And that was why she sat on a concrete step in a stairwell with her hands over her face and shook. Sean found her there. He'd come straight from a shift, and he had a bag of oranges under his arm for their mother, and he stood on the step below her without saying anything for a minute. And then he sat down. It took him 5 minutes to get it out of her. Not all of it. Just the earrings, and the 3 weeks held, and the second date on the contract, and even that much she gave him in the flattest voice she could manage. He sat very still while she told him. Then he set the oranges down on the step and said, "What's the address?" "Sean, just the address, Clara. I'm not going to do anything. I want to stand in front of her, and I want her to look at my face while I say it." And Clara turned and looked at her brother, who was 24 years old, and who had carried their mother down 3 flights of stairs in July, and never once mentioned it. And she said the thing she'd been saying to herself in that narrow room off the back stairs for 80 nights. "Listen to me. If you walk into that house angry, you'll never walk back out of it." He didn't understand her. He thought she meant they'd hurt him. She didn't mean that at all. And she couldn't explain what she did mean without telling him about a boathouse and a telephone call and a folded piece of paper under her heel. And so she said it again, slower, and she held onto his wrist while she said it. "If you walk in there angry, you stay there. Do you understand me? Promise me." And in the end he promised her, because she was his sister, and because she was crying. And he picked up the oranges and they went back down the corridor together and washed their faces at the fountain before they went in. Maureen watched them come through the door, and she watched them for a while, the way a mother watches, and she saw whatever there was to see. She waited until Sean went out to fill the water jug. Then she took her daughter's hand in both of hers and she said, in a voice with almost nothing left in it, "Clara, maybe we stop." "Ma, no, listen to me." She had to take a breath. "I sit here in this bed every single day, and I watch you getting thinner and older right in front of me, and I know what it's costing you, and don't you tell me it isn't." She stopped and started again. "I'd rather go," she said. "I would rather go than sit here and watch you spend yourself on me." 5 days later, on the 85th, Vivienne Falcone knocked on the door of Rosalind Marchetti's sitting room at 9 in the morning and asked if she might come in, and closed it behind her, and sat down without being asked twice. Rosalind put her pen down. The two of them had been perfectly courteous with one another for 61 days, and had never once had a conversation with the door shut. "My father telephoned again on Sunday," Vivienne said. Rosalind waited. "He didn't ask me anything. He never asks. He just says one sentence and hangs up, and I sit there afterward for an hour working out what the sentence meant." She looked down at her hands, and then back up, and her voice was perfectly level. "If I go home from this house without a wedding, I don't go home to my father's disappointment. I go home to a man who has to explain to 4 other men why his only daughter came back." And Rosalind Marchetti, who had spent 61 days deciding privately that she rather liked this girl, understood her completely for the first time, because she had never once believed that Vivienne loved her son, and she'd never required it. She required only that the girl want the same thing badly enough to be useful, and here it was. "She's leaving anyway," Vivienne said. "Isn't she?" The staff talk. "Her term ends this week." "She's leaving on paper," Rosalind said. "That isn't the same as leaving." Vivienne looked at her. "It isn't the same at all," Rosalind said. "If that girl walks off this property on Friday afternoon with her wages in her hand and her head up, then somewhere between here and Providence my son gets into a car, and he finds her. And whatever comes after that comes after that. And I have no say in any of it, and neither do you." She turned her chair slightly toward the window. "A woman doesn't stay gone because you send her away. She stays gone because she doesn't want to come back." There was a long pause in that room. Then Vivienne Falcone said, "All right." And something in the way she said it made even Rosalind pause for a second, because it was the sound of a woman who had just set something down that she was never going to be able to pick up again. "It has to be the last day," Rosalind said. "The last morning. Nothing before. Or she'll walk out and be pitied for it, and pity is worse than anything. And it has to be in front of nobody. And," she said, and this was the only part she said twice, "it has to be a day he isn't here." She got up, went to the small writing desk by the window, and took out a leather diary. Not a household diary. Her son's. She kept a copy of it, in her own hand, and had kept one every week for 7 years. Since the afternoon, she came out of a church between 2 coffins, and understood that the only son she had left was going to spend the rest of his life being a target. She had never once thought of it as anything but a mother's arithmetic. Where he was, who he was with, what time he'd be back, so that if the telephone ever rang the way it rang once before, she'd know within the hour instead of the day. 7 years. Every week. She turned to the page for that Friday. "Boston," she said. "Meeting at 9, second one at 11, lunch with the Lombardi people. He leaves here at 5:30 in the morning, and he isn't back before 4. She closed the diary. 7 in the morning, she said. And upstairs, on that same 85th day, Adrian Marchetti stood at the window of his office and worked out that he had not been alone in a room with Clara Doyle in 68 days. It had taken him a shamefully long time to notice, because a man in his position is not accustomed to being avoided and has no practice at recognizing it. But he'd begun to. She was never on the stairs when he was on the stairs. She was never in the dining room when he came through it, though the water pitcher was always full. Twice he had come around a corner and heard a door close very quietly ahead of him. And once, 3 weeks ago, he'd said good morning to her in the passage outside the library, and she had said good morning back with her eyes on the floor and gone on walking, and he had stood there afterward for longer than he cared to remember. He picked up the telephone on his desk and made a call he hadn't made about anybody in 7 years. Nico Ferraro was 44 years old, had run security on that property since before the old man died, and was the only man alive who Adrian had never once had to check on. "Come up when you get in," Adrian said. "There's something I want done quietly," Nico said. Quietly from who? And Adrian was silent for a moment, standing there at the window looking down at the lawn, and then he said, "From everybody," and hung up. That evening Clara came up to the narrow room off the back stairs at 20 to 10, with her feet aching and her hair damp from the sinks. She turned on the lamp. There was a folded sheet of household notepaper propped against the base of it, in Edith Landry's writing, 3 lines long. Tomorrow, 7 in the morning. Back garden. The rose beds are to be turned over and the soil replaced. Don't be late. She was up at 5:30 out of habit, and at 10 of 7 she came out of the service door with her sleeves already rolled and walked down to the back garden. And it was the 88th day, which was the last day, which was the whole reason it was happening that morning and no other. The house behind her was quiet. Adrian Marchetti's car had gone up the drive in the dark, at 5:30, bound for Boston and 3 meetings and a lunch, and every person on that property knew he wouldn't be back before 4 in the afternoon. There was nobody in the garden but the 2 women waiting for her on the gravel path. The moment came swiftly, just as it had been set in motion from her very first day. The younger one got behind her and took hold of her arms, and Clara didn't fight, and it is worth saying why, because she thought about it clearly even as it was happening. She was 27 years old, and she had lifted grown men off emergency room floors, and she was stronger than Vivian Falcone. But the woman holding her arms was Salvatore Falcone's only daughter, and Clara had a mother in room 411, West Wing, in the bed nearest the window, with rounds a little after 7, so she let herself be put down onto the gravel. And Rosalind Marchetti lifted the bucket and emptied it over her head and said the thing about the earth without ever raising her voice, and told her to be gone by morning, and then it was over, and the 2 of them stood there waiting for her to break. That is where the story stopped before. This is what happened next. Clara Doyle knelt on that path, and she didn't move for 4 or 5 seconds, and she could feel the weight of it on her shoulders, and she could hear her own breathing, and nothing else. She thought about her mother's hand coming out for hers the second the door opened. She thought about her brother sitting down on a concrete step and setting a bag of oranges beside him, and she thought about the girl she'd been at 19, who had told a woman in a bed on the 4th floor that she was going to be a nurse. Then she opened her eyes. She could see the gravel about 8 inches in front of her knees, and a heap of loose soil on it, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she reached out with one hand, and she gathered up a handful of that soil off the path, and she put it back in the bucket. Nobody said anything. She did it again. The bucket was upright and empty on the gravel a foot to her left, and she reached over and dropped the second handful in, and it landed with a small sound in the bottom of it. Her hand was shaking so badly that half of it went down her wrist. She gathered another. Vivian Falcone was still holding her arms and had gone completely rigid, and after the 3rd handful she seemed to realize she was holding a woman who was working, and her grip loosened without any decision being made about it. Clara kept going. 4th handful. 5th. She worked at it the way she had worked at the floors of that hallway for 88 days, methodically, from the near side to the far side, not hurrying, the way you clean up something that has to be cleaned up. Rosalind Marchetti stood over her with her hands empty and watched a maid on her knees tidying the insult off the path, and in 40 years of running that house, nothing had ever happened to her that she had less idea what to do with. Vivian let go. She stepped back off the path onto the grass and stood there with her arms down. Clara got the last of what she could reach into the bucket. Then she put her hands flat on the gravel and pushed herself up onto her feet, and she stood there in front of the 2 of them, and she was steady. And she looked at Rosalind, and she said it quietly, in an ordinary voice, without any temper in it at all. "You can pour dirt on my head, but there's nothing of mine you can take." And then, from the far end of the path, where the hedge came around by the terrace steps, a man said, "Ma." Nobody had heard him. His second meeting had been cancelled by telephone at 6:20 that morning, and he had turned the car around on the highway at Attleboro and come home 3 hours early. And he had walked out through the terrace doors looking for nothing in particular, and he had been standing at the end of that path for some part of it. Nobody ever established exactly how much. He didn't shout. He didn't come down the path fast. Rosalind said his name, and he went past her without answering it. He went past Vivian Falcone the same way. Both of those women were standing directly in his path, and he walked around them the way a man walks around 2 chairs left out in a corridor. And neither of them existed for 1 second of it. He was taking his coat off as he came. He knelt down on the gravel in front of Clara, on both knees, in a $5,000 suit, and he put the coat around her shoulders and held it closed at the front with one hand, and he didn't say anything to her at all. He looked at her face. That was all he did. Then he stood up, and he turned around, and he looked at his mother, and he spoke so quietly that Vivian, 4 feet away, only caught it, because the garden was silent. "You've just done a thing," he said, "that I can't undo for you." He made the telephone call at 11:20 that morning, in the office off the front hall, and he made it with the door standing wide open and his mother sitting in the chair across from the desk, because he wanted her to hear every word of it, and he wanted her to know that was why. He asked for Salvatore Falcone, and he waited, and when the man came on the line, Adrian Marchetti was courteous, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't been. He said the arrangement between the two families was ended. He said the wedding wouldn't take place. He said Vivienne would be seen home that afternoon with every courtesy owed her, and that no reason would ever be given publicly, and that anybody who asked would be told the decision had come from this side and this side alone, so that nothing would attach to her name. Then he listened for about 40 seconds without saying anything. Then he said, "I understand what I'm doing," and put the telephone down. He knew exactly what he had just bought. A man doesn't turn away Boston on a Friday morning and go on shipping through that terminal unmolested. Rosalind said, "Do you have any idea what you've just cost this family?" He said, "Yes." She stood up. Then she said the only thing she had to say, and she said it without 1 inch of apology in her voice, standing in her dead husband's house at 62 years of age. "I have buried 2 men out of this family. 2. And you were 9 days from being tied to the one family between here and the state line that nobody would touch you through. I did what I have done every day for 7 years. I protected this house." And he looked at his mother for a long moment and said, "You put a girl on her knees in my garden." "She was leaving anyway. She was leaving with her wages," Adrian said. "And her name, and whatever she had left." He came around the desk. "That's all she had. Do you understand that? That's the whole of what that woman owned." And Rosalind Marchetti didn't answer him, because she genuinely did not understand it, and wouldn't for a long time yet. Clara was in the linen room at noon when Edith Landry came to find her, and Clara already had her canvas bag on the table. "My term ends today," Clara said. "I'd like to go this afternoon instead of tomorrow." Edith stood in the doorway. "Nobody's asked you to go. Nobody has to." And Edith Landry, who had run that house for 22 years, opened her mouth to say something, and then closed it again, and went and got the wages that were owed, all of them, including the 3 weeks that had been held, which came back that afternoon without 1 word of explanation, and without any earrings ever being mentioned again by anybody, ever. Adrian found her at the side of the house at 1:30, coming out of the service door with the bag over her shoulder. Her hair was still wet from the sinks. She hadn't managed to get all of it out, and there was still dirt in it at the back, dried gray, and she knew it, and she'd stopped caring somewhere around 11 that morning. He said, "Don't do this. There's a room in the east wing. Stay in it a week. Nobody comes near you." She said, "No." "Then let me put you somewhere. Anywhere. Tonight." He wasn't offering her money, and they both knew it, and that was the worst of it, because money she could have refused easily. He was offering to stand between her and the world, which was the only thing in his gift that she actually wanted, and he was offering it with his coat still folded over her arm because she hadn't found a way to give it back. So she said the thing she had come out of that door intending to say, and she said it looking straight at him, and she got through all of it without her voice going. "Please stop being kind to me." He didn't move. "Your kindness is killing my mother." And when he still didn't say anything, she said the rest of it, quietly. "The way you say a thing you've already worked out and can't unwork. Every time you look at me, your mother takes another day off her. That's not a figure of speech. 2 days she took, with a pen, in an office, and I'm not going to get them back, and my mother doesn't have days to give. So whatever this is, don't. Please. Don't be kind to me anymore." And then she took his coat off her arm and put it in his hands. And she walked away up the side of the house and out onto the gravel and down the length of that drive on foot, all the way to the iron gate. She had come through 88 days before, with a canvas bag that didn't fill, and she went through it and out onto the road, and she didn't look back once. And Adrian Marchetti stood where she had left him holding his own coat and did not follow her, because she had asked him not to, and because it was the only thing she had ever asked him for. That evening, Rosalind Marchetti went up alone to the study at the end of the west corridor and shut the door behind her. She stood in front of her husband's desk for a while, at the frame that had been on it for 7 years, the one with the 4 of them in it from a summer before any of this. She didn't cry. She wasn't a woman who cried, and she wasn't a woman who apologized, and she didn't do either of those things that evening. What she said, out loud, in an empty room, was this: "She saw me. That's what she did. That was the whole of it. It was never the medal." 2 days after she walked out through that gate, Adrian Marchetti called Nico Ferraro into the office and shut the door and gave him one instruction. I want to know everything that happened to Clara Doyle inside my house. Nico didn't ask him why. He had worked that property since before the old man died, and he had learned a long time ago which questions paid. He asked one thing only, which was how far back. And Adrian said, from the morning she came through the gate to the minute she walked out of it. And Nico said, 48 hours, and went away. He came back on the 92nd day at 3 in the afternoon with a plain folder, and set it on the desk, and stood there while Adrian read it. And he didn't summarize, because he'd been told to find out what happened, not to have an opinion about it. The first page was about a pair of earrings. They had been reported missing from the Blue Room on the 70th day, and 3 weeks of a maid's wages had been held pending an inquiry, and the corridor camera on that floor had been reported down since the Tuesday before. The earrings had never left the property. They were in the safe in Rosalind Marchetti's dressing room, in a small green case, and had been in it since the afternoon they were reported gone. And the woman from Boston who owned them had been reimbursed privately, in cash, 11 days later. Adrian turned the page. The second page was a photocopy of a contract. Household staff, current, D. The term of employment was set out on the second page in 2 dates, and the second date had been altered by hand. The original figure was still visible underneath. Beside the alteration were 2 initials in blue ink, written neatly, the way everything in that house was done. Adrian looked at that page for a while. Nico said nothing. The third page wasn't about the house at all. It was a hospital record, obtained the way Nico obtained things, and it set out that Maureen Doyle, 56, had been moved to inactive status on the transplant list, and it gave the 3 reasons, and not one of the 3 had anything to do with her heart. No coverage for the medication she'd have to take after the surgery. No stable ground floor housing to be discharged into. No named, registered caregiver on the form. Adrian read those 3 lines twice. Then he read them a third time. There was a 4th page. Nico had gone one step further than he'd been asked to, which was the reason he'd lasted 7 years. It was a summary of a disciplinary finding from the State Board of Nursing, dated the previous September. A registered nurse in an emergency department in Providence had given a dying man a medication he had no coverage for and no means to pay for. Her license had been suspended. Adrian sat back in his chair. He said, "That's why she was working in a diner." Nico said, "That's why she was working in a diner." And Adrian Marchetti sat there and understood, for the first time, that the woman who had knelt on wet concrete in an alley in August and kept him alive with a first aid kit off a wall had already lost her whole profession, 11 months before that night, for doing exactly the same thing for somebody who couldn't pay her either. She hadn't done it because it was him. She'd done it because that was what she did. That was who she'd been before she ever laid eyes on him. He closed the folder. Then he said, "Is there anything else?" And Nico said, "Yes," and went to the door and opened it. And Edith Landry was standing in the hall. She came in and she didn't wait to be asked, and she sat down in the chair across the desk with her hands in her lap. "I saw it," she said. "I was at the kitchen window. It looked straight down the path at the rose beds, and I was standing at that window when it happened, and I saw all of it, from the beginning." Adrian didn't say anything. "I didn't come out," she said. "I stood there. And when it was over, I went and put the kettle on because the girls were coming in at 8. Silence in that room. And it isn't the first thing," she said. "I've been in this house 22 years, and there's a great deal in it I've seen and said nothing about. And I told myself every single time that it wasn't my place, and that the family would handle it, and that a woman my age with no husband doesn't get another position at 60. She stopped. Then she said the rest of it flatly, without one word of defense for herself. "Every wrong thing that ever grew in this house grew because people like me stood at a window and decided it wasn't ours to stop." She stood up. "My keys are on the hall table," she said, and she went out. Adrian Marchetti sat alone for a while after that. Then he opened the folder again and turned back to the 3rd page and looked at the 3 lines, the coverage, the housing, the caregiver, and he read them one more time, slowly, the way a man reads a list he intends to work through. And there was one more thing at the very bottom of that page that he hadn't taken in on the first pass, which was an address, 3rd floor, no elevator. He picked up the telephone and got Nico in the hall in 2 rings, and said 2 words. "Bring the car." He could have sent Nico. Any man in his position would have sent somebody, and everybody involved would have understood it as generosity, and nobody would ever have thought less of him for it. He went himself. He climbed 3 flights in a building on the west side of Providence, with no elevator and a stairwell that smelled of other people's cooking. And he knocked on the door at the end, and when Sean Doyle opened it in a work shirt with a pot of something on the stove behind him, Adrian Marchetti said only that his name was Adrian and that he'd come about Maureen. What happened over the next 40 hours? Clara heard about afterward in pieces, and there wasn't a single promise anywhere in it. There were 3 pieces of paper. That was all it ever was, and she understood that better than anybody, because she was the one who'd read the 3 reasons off a form on the 4th floor of St. Anne's. The first was a private policy, written and paid a year forward, in the name of Maureen Doyle, with the medication schedule listed in it by name. The second was a lease on a house 8 minutes from the hospital, 1 story, no stairs at all, with heat that worked. The third was the hardest one, and the only one that took real doing, and it was a licensed home health nurse, hired, contracted, and entered on the hospital's form as the named caregiver responsible for a woman's recovery, on the line that had been blank in June. And with those 3 things filed, and the outstanding balance on that account settled in full without any discussion of it, a committee in a room on the 4th floor met on a Thursday morning and moved Maureen Doyle back to active status on the list. It wasn't a miracle. That was the part Clara couldn't get over, sitting in a kitchen with heat in it later that week. Nobody had healed her mother. 3 lines on a form had been unblocked by a man with money, and her mother had been dying for 2 years inside a system that never once looked at her heart. Sean told her about it, standing in the doorway of that kitchen with his hands in his pockets, and he said one thing about the whole of it, and it was the only thing he ever said about Adrian Marchetti to anybody. He didn't send anybody, Sean said. He came himself. There was a job for Sean, too, on the construction side, in the company that had an office and a name on the door, and paid by the hour like every other company in the state. Clara made one condition before she'd let him take it, and she made it in a room with Adrian on the other side of a table, and she made him put it in writing and sign it. If my brother ever sees so much as 1 envelope out of the other half of what you do, you fire him that day. He signed it. Then he put a canvas bag on the table and pushed it across to her. Inside was her father's coat. It had been washed, and it had been pressed, and the hole through the left side of it, up near the shoulder, had been closed with about 9 stitches in a thread that didn't match, in a color a shade off, in a line that wandered. It was, without any question, the worst repair Clara had ever seen on a garment in her life. I did it myself, he said. I didn't want anybody else touching it. She didn't answer him. She put her hand flat on the front of it and left it there for a second, and then she folded it up, and neither of them said anything else about it, then or ever. Up in Boston, an old man was sitting in a room over a print shop, working out how badly he had been embarrassed. Salvatore Falcone had put his only daughter into a house for 61 days, and had got her back with nothing, and on the second night after she came home he told her so, in the kitchen, in front of nobody. I married you off once, he said. You made a mess of it. Don't make me sit here and work out what else you're good for. And on the 94th day, in the morning, somebody knocked on the door of a small rented house, 8 minutes from the hospital, and Clara opened it, and Vivienne Falcone was standing on the step. Clara's first thought was that she'd come to finish it. Whatever a Falcone shows up at your door for at 9 in the morning, it isn't good news. And Clara stood there with one hand on the frame, and every muscle in her back gone hard. But the woman on the step didn't say anything at all. She was shaking, not crying, shaking, the way people shake when they haven't slept and have made a decision on the way over and aren't sure they can hold on to it. And Clara Doyle looked at her for a moment. Then she did the only thing she has ever known how to do with a person standing in front of her who has nothing left to give her. She stepped back out of the doorway. She went to the counter and filled a glass of water from the tap and set it down on the table. And she pulled out a chair with her foot and said, "Sit down." She didn't mention the garden, not one word about it, then or later. Vivienne sat down and put both hands around that glass, and then she did start to cry, and it took her a while to get anything out, and when she did, it came out in the wrong order. There was never going to be a groom, she said. Clara said, "What? That wedding. It was never going to have a groom standing at the front of it. My father and Tommy Barone had it worked out from the first week." She got a breath in. "I was going to be a widow before I was ever a wife, and Providence would come to Boston with the paper already signed, and there wouldn't be one single question asked anywhere about how." She looked up. "It's still on," she said. "They're still doing it, just not there." She sat by her mother's bed for an hour that afternoon and couldn't make herself stand up, and Maureen Doyle watched her do it and eventually put out her hand and took her daughter's wrist. 2 years I've been dying in front of you, she said. And you've been dying right along with me. And you couldn't see it. I don't want a life that costs me yours. Go on, Clara. I'll be right here. The gathering that evening had been arranged weeks earlier for another purpose entirely, and nobody had bothered to cancel the room, and that was the thing nobody in either family ever quite got over afterward, that it all came out on the exact day the wedding was supposed to have been. 2 families in one house, and men from 3 others sitting along the wall as witnesses, because in that world a thing said in front of witnesses is the only law there is. Clara Doyle came in through the service door in her father's coat, with 9 crooked stitches in the shoulder. She didn't accuse Tommy Barone. She had no proof of anything, and she knew exactly what the word of a maid was worth in a room like that one. So she did something else. She looked at Rosalind Marchetti, and she put a choice on the table in front of her, quietly, in the same ordinary voice she'd used on the gravel. I saw you in your husband's study, she said. I didn't understand it, and I never told anybody. But you told him everything, didn't you? Including where your son was going to be that night in August. The color went out of Rosalind's face. She had spent all this time believing she was protecting one shameful, private, ordinary thing, and she understood in the space of a breath that she had been protecting something else entirely. That was the mistake, and it had 3 floors to it. She had told a man she trusted where her son would be, every week, for 7 years, and the gun in that alley had been aimed by her own diary. She had spent every hour since June trying to drive out of that house the one person alive who could point at the traitor. And the woman she had put on her knees in her own garden was the woman who had kept her son breathing on a stockroom floor while everybody else in the world drove past him. Rosalind Marchetti stood up in front of all of them. She was 62 years old, and she had never in her life explained herself to anybody. And she stood there and said all of it out loud. And then she took a prepaid telephone out of her bag and put it on the table with the messages still on it. Dates, times, the name of the street off Federal Hill. Tommy Barone was already moving. He got as far as the front doors. Nico Ferraro had closed the gates at 4 o'clock that afternoon because a folded square of paper had come out from under the heel of a shoe the night before and been put into his hand, and he had read it twice and doubled the men on the wall without telling anybody why. What happened to Tommy Barone happened out of that room and out of anybody's sight. Salvatore Falcone was finished in the space of about 4 minutes, and it wasn't Adrian who finished him. 3 families had come to witness a wedding, and instead sat and watched a man be shown to have broken the peace himself. And by the following week the room over the print shop in Boston had somebody else in it. Vivian stood up and said her part, all of it, in front of her father. It was the first sentence she had spoken in 30 years that wasn't calculated to please him. And near the end of it, in the hallway, Adrian Marchetti stood in front of Tommy Barone with a weapon in his hand, and everything in him wanting to use it. And Clara said 7 words from 4 feet away. If you do that, who did I save? He stood there a long moment. Then he gave the man to the 3 families to be dealt with under their own law, and he didn't do it himself. And that was the beginning of everything that came after. 21 days later, Rosalind Marchetti came to the 4th floor of St. Anne's. She was living in a small rented house by then, with nobody to keep it for her. Clara was there, and Sean, and Edith Landry, and 2 of the women from the kitchen. I judged you by where you were standing, she said, and not by anything you did. I have spent my entire life weighing people to find out what they were good for. You were the only person in that house who never weighed anybody. Clara didn't tell her it was all right. She said, you hurt me, and I'm not going to pretend you didn't, but I'm putting it down. Not for your sake, because I can't carry it any further. And then she pulled out a chair and set it down for her, and Rosalind Marchetti sat in it. In February, Maureen Doyle got a heart. 9 days after the surgery, she walked 10 steps in a hospital corridor with her son on one side and her daughter on the other, and no one holding her up. Sean spent that spring learning to read building plans. Clara filed for a hearing to have her license reinstated, and she went to it in a borrowed jacket. And she told the truth about what she'd done and why, and she waited. Adrian began pulling the other half of that business apart, and it was slow, and it cost him money and men and 2 friendships. And it wasn't a miracle. It was a decision he had to keep making every week. And on a warm evening, he took her back to the alley off Federal Hill, where the diner was a hardware store now, and Clara took both silver medals out of her pocket and put them into his hands. You've carried both of these for 7 years, she said. Give one of them away. he asked her on the spot, standing on the exact ground where she had knelt down beside him. And here is what that story leaves behind. What a person is worth has nothing to do with where they're standing, or what they own, or what they can be used for. It shows up in what they do for somebody who has no way of ever paying them back. People can pour dirt on your head, but nobody can take your dignity from you, because the only way it ever goes is if you set it down yourself. And a debt of money gets paid and it's finished, while a debt of kindness follows a person for the rest of their life. If this story reached you tonight, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like, and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. I'd love to know what you felt while you listened, and whether any part of it looked like something you've lived through yourself, so please tell me in the comments, because those words come straight from your heart, and they mean a great deal to us. Wishing all of you good health, quiet days, and real peace in your homes. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next video.